with not a stain on it. She looked up quickly, startled and annoyed. "What on earth do you mean by that, Louisa?" "Just what you meant, Mother," I told her, and went across to my own room. Chapter 4. I dare say every woman retains a sentiment for an old lover, even if he is inevitably lost, retains it at least until a new one effaces him. And at one time, 10 years before, when I was 18 and Jim was 25, we had been engaged. Nothing came of it, for Mother had never wanted me to marry and leave her alone, and Jim made things rather painful by accusing her of selfishness and declining to share me with her. All in all, it had been an unhappy business, and 2 years later he had married Helen and had now been married to her on and off for 8 years. The women of the Crescent had never much liked Helen. That was natural, for she flouted their prejudices and was openly scornful of their profoundest convictions. Besides, she was young and attractive, a combination they found it hard to forgive. "A silly flighty little fool," Mrs. Dalton said one day, shortly after the marriage. And Brian Dalton had smiled into his teacup. "You might say to my wife," he stated to the room at large, "that she is very easy to look at." But Helen or no Helen, I carried into my room that late afternoon a terrible and gnawing fear. It could not be long before the police discovered that Jim Wellington had been in that house at or about the time the crime was discovered, that he had slipped away without letting his presence be known, and that I had concealed that fact from them. I was bewildered, too. Why on earth run away from a thing like that, if he knew what it was? Why not raise an alarm, shout, call for the police, do any one of the normal things which normal people do under abnormal conditions? I dressed. The Crescent would dress for dinner in the middle of an earthquake, in a state of anxiety bordering on frenzy, and dinner itself proved to be trying beyond words, for Mother had found a grievance and was worrying it like a dog a bone. "What I cannot understand, Louisa," she said, "is that you did not come back and tell me at once." "I was back here by 4:30. You seem to think you owe me no consideration whatever." Perhaps my nerves were not what they should have been, for that upset me. "I've shown you every possible consideration for 28 years, Mother," I said, and what with one thing and another I burst into tears and left the table to find the Daltons coming up our porch steps, and the 3 Talbots not far behind them. It is not strange, to anyone who knows the Crescent, that the news had not spread its entire length until the late extra edition of the evening papers came out. For one thing, our servants, as I have already said, provide our grapevine telegraph, and the Lancaster servants were being held strictly incommunicado in the Lancaster house. For another, so well has our planting grown in the last 40 years or so, that we ourselves are practically incommunicado unless we choose otherwise. Whatever its faults, the Crescent considers it a sin to cut down a tree or prune back its shrubbery. The Crescent reads the evening paper after dinner, not before it. When the paper is finished, it is carefully refolded and sent back to the servants. And the Crescent never reads extra editions. When the reporters from the various papers, having exhausted the patience of the police, began to ring doorbells along the road, most of the occupants were concerned with the sacred rite of dressing for dinner, and later with the even more sacred rite of dining. Not one of them gained access to any of the 5 houses. But undoubtedly they told the servants, for Lizzie at Mrs. Talbot sent her down to dinner that night in a pair of odd shoes, and the Dalton butler, Joseph, forgot to place dinner napkins for the first time in 25 years. But as our servants speak only when spoken to, it was fully 7:30 when this same Joseph walked into the library with a tray on which lay a neatly folded copy of an extra edition of an evening paper and then quietly retired. And it was 7:31 when Mr. Dalton, leaping to his feet, pressed the library bell for him again and said, "Will you tell Mrs. Dalton that Mrs. Lancaster has been murdered, brutally killed with an axe?" Incredible all of it, of course, unless one knows us. It was after 7:30 then, by the time the Crescent was fully informed, front and back, and only slightly after that when, having made their polite inquiries and offers of help at the Lancasters, the Talbots and the Daltons gathered at our house. I showed them into the drawing room, Mrs. Dalton mincing along on her high heels, Brian Dalton looking immaculate but shocked, Lydia carrying and dropping a knitting bag, and Mrs. Talbot laden as usual with the heavy old-fashioned reticule which carried her innumerable keys. George trailed behind them all, uncomfortable and apparently feeling that, being more or less in the presence of death, he should walk on his tiptoes. Or perhaps for fear that because of his youth, he is only 30, he might be sent away if noticed. George and I still constitute the children of the Crescent. Looks like a coroner's jury. He whispered to me. Be careful. And anything you say may be held against you. Actually, it turned out to be something of the sort, with his mother acting as a sort of star witness who regarded the entire catastrophe as a direct result of old Mrs. Lancaster's failure to lock herself in. Always told her that, she boomed in her heavy voice. Told her to lock things up. Told her to have her bedroom door locked. Told her so this very day. Her lying helpless in that bed, and all this crime going on. For, as it turned out, Mrs. Talbot had been the last one outside of the family to see Mrs. Lancaster alive. Except the man with the axe, she boomed, and all of us shuddered. She was a kindly woman, in spite of her eccentricity, and for many years almost her only outside contact with the world had been her occasional visits to Mrs. Lancaster, who was connected with her by marriage. Mrs. Lancaster's first husband having been a brother of the crayon portrait. We listened to her story with avid interest. She had gone at 2:30 to sit with the invalid, as she sometimes did. Everything had been normal at that time, the old lady lying quietly in the big four-poster with the tester top, and Emily with her. It had been Margaret's afternoon off, for the sisters alternated that part of the day in the sick room, and she was shut away in her room. Old Mrs. Lancaster, however, had been rather fretful. She was feeling the heat, and as she did not like electric fans, Mrs. Talbot had taken the palm leaf fan from Emily and sat beside her, fanning her. Then I noticed that key she wore on a chain around her neck, and I gave her a good talking to, she said, or rather shouted.